worship service of Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. This month at the church, we're thinking about stewardship. Our focus is on the table that is at the center of our life, the communion table. Now, it may seem a little strange to think about stewardship in connection with the communion table, but it's an interesting paradigm to consider the Lord's table not only as the place where we receive, but also as the giving table. You see, when we receive communion, we recognize God's gift to us. God brought the beginning of the realm of God. Jesus gave new meaning to the Passover meal by instilling in it the symbols of His selflessness, His sacrifice. And in response to this love, we are called to give of ourselves. Each time we receive communion, we are invited to bring open hearts to receive God's good gifts. We're also invited to bring open hands with which to carry those gifts to the world. Today we're reflecting on the story of Jesus' feeding a crowd in the wilderness, providing a table in the wilderness. In performing this miracle, He teaches the crowd about God's involvement in their lives. The realm of God is present even in the wilderness. Now, I'd like you to think of a time in your life when you were in the wilderness, really in the wilderness, physically. What was that like? Maybe you were surrounded by mountains. Maybe you were visiting a desert. Maybe you were in the woods. The wilderness can be a beautiful place if everything is going all right, if you have all of your supplies, if you have what you need, your compass, your bedding, your food. You can feel confident about your visit to the wilds then. Now, you may not have the resort amenities that a hotel might have with a beautiful continental breakfast laid out for you in the morning. But if you have your supplies, you're all right. Sometimes the wilderness can be a place of healing and of retreat. At other times, the wilderness can be quite daunting. This is especially true when we get off the beaten path and we don't have what we need. Have you ever been lost in the wilderness? Suddenly, everything looks the same. The trees, the knolls and valleys. You go one direction, you mount a little hill, and the trees look exactly like the ones that you just left. Once when I was on a camping trip in the wilderness of Colorado, I left the campsite to go fetch some water from a nearby stream. When I turned back and climbed the knoll, the campsite was nowhere to be found. I turned the other way and walked a little bit, only to find myself further in the woods. Back and forth I went, a feeling of desperation beginning to bubble up inside of me. It seemed that time stood still, and I wondered what would become of me. It was really quite a frightening feeling. Ultimately, I decided I should slow down and go back to the place where I had retrieved the water. And when I was there, I was able to think through and remember to retrace the direction from which I had come. But you know, that feeling of desperation stuck with me. Lost in the wilderness. How would I survive? The wilderness can be a rather desperate place. If we're physically in the wilderness, there are so many challenges to overcome. Most of us really are accustomed to the conveniences and the gadgets that make our lives ever so easy. We're not used to living in the wilds. Maybe that's why we're so fascinated by movies or television shows where people overcome insurmountable odds just to survive in the wilderness. These shows can also be a kind of paradigm for the internal struggles or the emotional wildernesses that we sometimes face. Sometimes we're emotionally or spiritually in a wilderness. Something happens to us where we lose our bearings. We wonder where we are, how we got to this place. What should we do next? I wonder if you saw this story last year. It was in the news. It was about a young woman who was in her own wilderness, and she texted her father every day for 5 years after he had died. The leading line was, "Arkansas woman texted father's number every day after he died. She got a response 4 years later." The article read, "For 4 years, Chastity Patterson, then 22, of Newport, Arkansas, had been mourning the death of Jason Liggins. Though Jason was not her biological father, he had been so much like a father to her that she called him Dad. After he died, Chastity continued to text his phone every day to update him about her life. While she didn't expect a response, the daily texting was a way of dealing with her grief. In her message on October 25th, the night before the 4th anniversary of Jason's death, she told about how she'd beaten cancer and how she hadn't gotten sick since his passing. She also wrote about falling in love and having her heart broken, joking that Jason would have killed the guy. After 4 years, a man named Brad wrote back to her. He said, "I'm not your father, but I've been getting all your messages for the past 4 years. I lost my daughter in a car wreck in August of 2014, and your messages have kept me alive. You remind me that there is a God. When you text me, I know that it's a message from God." In her sorrow, Chastity searched for meaning, and somewhat ironically, as he received the text, Brad found meaning. Her text reminded him of God. Many people find themselves in the wilderness, searching for meaning. In today's passage, there was a crowd searching. They were searching for answers. They were searching for Jesus in the wilderness. They had been listening to Jesus and to his disciples' teaching, and they wanted more. Interestingly, Jesus and his disciples were on a bit of a search themselves. They were trying to get some respite, actually, from the crowds. They were rather in an emotional and spiritual wilderness of their own. You see, the disciples had just retrieved the body of John the Baptist after Herod had offered John's head to Herodias. They had taken his body and they had placed it in a tomb. I'm sure that they were emotionally exhausted. And Jesus, too, was brokenhearted. But the crowds were relentless. They busily pursued them. Mark 6, verse 31 says, "For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." And so Jesus suggested an opportunity to escape to the wilds, to get away. Though the wilderness is a place of desolation, it is also a place of respite. We find that true today as they did then. It's a place where they found that God provided for them. Remember when the Israelites wandered through the wilderness? God heard their cry and took good care of them. Moses heard from God that they would not starve in the wilderness, but that God would provide a way. The people discovered God's provisions with a morning surprise. At the crack of dawn, they found when a layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So, although the wilderness was a place of desolation, the Israelites also knew that it was a place where people went to regroup, to know God's care. Jesus went to the wilderness with his disciples to find solace. We know what this is like, to try to get away to find healing. Those of us who enjoy visiting parks and taking nature walks know this. Just this week, I learned that Allegheny County has a new logo and a tagline that celebrates the restorative elements of Western New York. Live deliberately in the Western New York wilds. Now, in researching and developing this logo, the team discovered that many people travel here. They come here and they purchase a home, sometimes a second home, sometimes their only home, because they want to live here because of the restorative power of the beauty of nature that is all around here. Do you like that bumper sticker? People sometimes go far and wide to make space, to allow room for God to speak, to look for answers. And so the crowds were searching for answers, answers that they were just beginning to understand. But they wanted more, so they kept looking. They liked what they had heard from Jesus and his disciples. They saw them get into a boat and go to a deserted place. Verse 33 says, "Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot, from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Bible says Jesus had compassion on them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. He taught, and he taught, and he taught. And as the day wore on, folks started getting hungry. The disciples were also concerned about these physical needs, and they encouraged Jesus to send the crowd into the villages to go and get themselves something to eat. Jesus said to the disciples, "You give them something to eat." Now, he had already empowered them to do miracles. Earlier in the book of Mark, we see that Jesus had given the disciples the power to demonstrate the presence and the qualities of the realm of God by working miracles. Chapter 3, verses 14 and 15 say, "And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the message, and to have authority to cast out demons." And again in chapter 6, Mark tells of the authority Jesus gave to the 12. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. Surely God could work through the disciples, these representatives of the realm of God, to feed a hungry crowd. But the disciples didn't understand the instruction. They could have done it themselves. They didn't get it. They think that Jesus wants them to go and buy bread for the crowd. They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" They don't understand the power that Jesus has given to them. In the book of Mark, this behavior of the disciples is consistent with the way that he portrays the disciples. Scholars have frequently pointed out that the disciples do not understand Jesus and his message and his actions. They're slow to put into practice what he tells them to do. In some ways, they're almost anti-models of how to follow Jesus. But it poses a good question for us. In his writing, Mark uses the disciples as foils. Their purpose is to prompt the reader to ask, will I misperceive and misbehave in the manner of the disciples? Or will I understand and do what Jesus says? And so Jesus sends the disciples to go and to discover the resources that were already in the crowd. "How many loaves have you?" he says. "Go and see." They don't have to look elsewhere. What they need is already at hand. They just need to locate it. The disciples find 5 loaves and 2 fish. You know, bread played a multifaceted role in Jewish life. Of course, bread was the real life staple. But beyond that, it was a symbol of the divine presence and provision, particularly in the wilderness wandering, as we talked about earlier. Fish were also commonplace in the diet around the Sea of Galilee. The fish here were likely gutted and the head still was on them, and they were probably dried out. Now, I would be remiss not to share with you a story about my travels to the Sea of Galilee. On the shore of the sea there, we ate at a small outdoor cafe, and we were given the opportunity to eat fish like this. I confess, as a longtime aquarium owner and a lover of fish, I did not order the fish with the head on it. It was a little too personal for me. Speaking of fish, there's an interesting undercurrent in this story. You remember that in ancient cultures, fish and other sea creatures are associated with chaos. To them, the waters, the chaos with its lack of order was evil. You remember in the creation account, God makes order by separating the land from the water, and it's good. Water to the ancients, with its chaos, doesn't reflect a God of order. And so this story reflects these understandings. You can see the double meanings here. In this story of the inbreaking of the realm of God, God transforms the creatures from below into something usable and good, life-giving sources of nutrition. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves, and he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. It's interesting the wording that Mark uses here to describe the events. Jesus took, blessed, broke, and gave. That sounds a lot like Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples, doesn't it? Mark uses the same verbs as in the Last Supper. This process of giving and receiving points to an even greater event, as the Lord's Supper is itself an anticipation of the great banquet at the end of time. It's neat to see how these stories and events are multi-layered. The narrative continues. Not only did the members of the crowd eat to their fill, but 12 baskets were left over, and all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. There was a superabundance. It reflects the generosity of God. God provided abundant material resources for all, a table in the wilderness. Just as in ancient times, God is concerned with the material goods necessary for survival. God wants people to have what they need to survive and to flourish. And the same is true for us today. God is still working to provide. One way that God continues to operate in the world is through Jesus' followers. Jesus' words to the disciples in the text are the same words that could be spoken to us. You give them something to eat. Our resources are already present. Our task is to find them and to use them. This week, the church mailed out cards asking folks to consider how they will give of their time, their talents, and their resources to provide the resources that the church needs to carry out its ministries. We're also including them in emails. We're trying to plan for the next year to see what we have to work with. By asking, sometimes we learn people are willing to share talents that we didn't even know that they had. What might you offer? You may think that you don't have much to give, whether it's time or talent or finances, but each of us has something unique to give. Each of us brings something unique to the table, and one person can make a big difference. In a church where Mark served as a youth minister many years ago, there was a man who was especially good at woodworking. One year he decided that for a Christmas Advent celebration, he would do something very special. During the fall months, he took orders and then he sawed and shaped hundreds of pieces of wood, and he made kits for people to make step stools out of. And then on the evening of the celebration, he opened up the boxes and unloaded the kits with all the pieces, with the screws included, and we made step stools galore. People loved working on those step stools. It was a great time of fellowship, and folks felt a great sense of accomplishment in making them. Mark and I still remember that evening as a special event in the life of the church. We have warm memories of it when we use our step stool some 30 years later. In another place and time, in a church where I was serving in Tennessee, there was a couple that joined the church after moving from Louisiana. This couple loved adventure. They enjoyed loading up in cars and even in the church bus in time, and then taking trips to the mountains and hiking, going on picnics and camping, whatever struck them. They started planning events, and before you knew it, folks from outside the church were joining in the adventures and being included in the life of the church. It created a bit of a culture change in the church. The energy level increased just from the investment of this one couple. I've heard lots of great stories from Grace United of people who have made their mark on the church. There's the friendship bread. One gentleman baked and brought a loaf of bread every week to give to someone who needed a little extra tender, loving care. There are mission projects and ministries that were spearheaded by one person, and then others joined in, changing the fabric of the church. I'm sure that each of us in our own lives have our own stories of individuals who have made an impact on the lives of others or of our own lives by their contributions of time and talent or financial resources. Some of us have benefited from scholarships offered by church persons or mentors who have shaped us by the things that they have said. Maybe it was a Sunday school teacher or an elder or a youth leader who said just the thing that we needed to hear. Or maybe it was a homemade meal delivered during a difficult time in our life. These gifts of time and talent and resources can really change lives. The people of this church have so many assets, so many gifts. We have all that we need to accomplish great things. God is wanting to transform the world, and God is wanting to transform Wellsville. And do you know how God plans to do this? Through us, as we live out our lives. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is both a model and an assurance. It is a model that God has provided, and it is an assurance that we have the resources that we need to accomplish what we are called to do. As we act on what God has given us, God multiplies our efforts. And so let us be faithful in giving of our time, our talents, and our financial resources so that God might accomplish great things in and through us. Amen.
The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me the quiet waters by. He leadeth me, he leadeth me the quiet waters by. My soul he doth restore again, and me to walk doth make within the paths of blessedness, in for his own name's sake. Within the paths of blessedness, in for his own name's sake. Yea, though I pass through shadowed vale, yet will I fear no ill. For thou art with me, and thy rod and staff me comfort still. Thy rod and staff me comfort still. My table thou hast furnished in presence of my foes. My head with blood thou dost anoint. My head thou dost with oil anoint, and my cup overflows. Goodness and mercy